Be a man who can face breakup, lose a job, deal with debt and still say I'll figure it out. Be a man who watches his world collapse, feels the pain, bleeds in silence, and still sharpens his sword. Be a man who doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't cry for attention. He builds himself in the dark. Be a man who turns rejection into fuel, betrayal into discipline, and loneliness into a fortress. Be a man who doesn't fold under pressure, who looks failure in the eye and grins back. Be a man who leads, who protects, who walks alone if he must, because weakness is contagious and strength is a choice. Be a man who earns respect without asking, who doesn't need validation, who becomes the storm. Be a man who doesn't escape reality, but dominates it. Be a man who turns pain into power, heartbreak into hunger, and setbacks into strategy. Be a man who walks through hell, lights a cigar, and keeps walking. Be a man who doesn't flinch when life throws knives. He catches them and learns how to aim. Be a man who gets stabbed in the back and forges armor from the betrayal. Be a man who hears you're not good enough and makes it his war cry. Be a man who doesn't seek comfort, he seeks conquest. Be a man who knows love is a gift, but never a leash. Be a man who commands silence louder than noise. Be a man whose scars tell stories, and whose silence makes cowards nervous. Be a man who doesn't fear being alone. He fears becoming average. Be a man who sees through manipulation, breaks free from emotional slavery, and refuses to be tamed. Be a man who is calm in chaos, brutal in battle, and loyal only to truth. Be a man who doesn't react, he calculates. Be a man who doesn't follow trends, he builds empires. Be a man who makes peace with his demons and uses them as generals. Be a man who takes losses like lessons, not excuses. Be a man who keeps his circle tight, his focus tighter, and his mission untouchable. Be a man who never begs for a seat at the table. He builds his own and sits like a king. Be a man who is too focused to be distracted, too wise to be deceived, and too dangerous to be controlled. Be a man who knows that peace is earned through war, and softness is a luxury built on strength. Be a man who doesn't chase butterflies. He builds a kingdom so lush, they come to him. Be a man who doesn't fear heartbreak. He fears mediocrity. Be a man who turns silence into strategy and pressure into diamonds. Be a man who doesn't ask for mercy. He becomes the consequence. Be a man whose presence changes the room, whose eyes hold storms, and whose words weigh like bullets. Be a man who's feared by weakness, respected by kings, and loved only by the real. Be a man who never submits to a broken system, who walks through illusions and sees reality for what it is. Be a man who bends fate with discipline and carves legacy with pain. Be a man who is hunted by his past, haunted by his vision, and still walks forward without flinching. Be a man who never loses himself to love, to lust, or to lies. Be a man who knows his worth is not defined by a woman, a paycheck, or applause. Be a man who dies on his feet rather than lives on his knees. Be a man who walks like time owes him nothing and still gives the world everything. Be a man who can smile at chaos, laugh in war, and love without chains. Be a man forged in fire, fueled by failure, and crowned by solitude. Be a man who no longer needs to prove himself, because he already became everything they said he couldn't be. Get the Sigma Code book now, because while others chase, you build. While others beg, you conquer. While others simp, you rule. Become the man you were born to be. Comment. Sigma and I will DM you the link to check out now. Like this content? Then do the Sigma thing. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next wake-up call. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Iron sharpens iron, and smash that like button like a man who knows his worth. This is Brave Minds, where the truth hits harder than your ex's regrets. Until next time, stay sharp, stay sovereign, and never simp. Stay Putinized.